Let's see. Okay, so this is the Urban Tree Festival. It's our first day. It's the 4th live event. We've got Geert Vermeire and Rich Blundell together. They're going to tell you about Into the Atmosphere, which of course is a very popular topic because there's a sweetener involved, and I'm sure they'll reveal the sweetener as we go through the presentation. However, the two of them are amongst a number of about 80 contributors who've come to the Urban Tree Festival, all of whom have waived their fees. All of them are giving up their time and expertise freely to you to entertain and inform you. So what we're asking you to do is, if you haven't done so already, we'd love you to donate to the festival as a whole. And what we hope to be able to do is to give every contributor an honorarium. It won't be anything like what they would might be able to command in fees, but it'll be a gesture, something to say thank you for coming and making the festival like it is. And in the chat, you'll find the link to how you can donate. Okay, so we have Geert Vermeire, who's going to introduce Rich to you. And I'm going to hand over to her.
Thank you, Andrew, and hello to all. It's a delight to see so many known faces, and an even bigger delight to see so many unknown faces. Rich and I will take you on a journey starting today with a presentation of about an hour, and then the chance to have a dialogue together. I'm Geert Vermeire, for the ones that don't know me yet. I'm a writer in the first place, but extending my practice to walking and other creative activities relating to embodied reading and writing. I'm as well one of the founders of the Milena principle, which is an open collective inviting scientists and artists to meet. And now I'm involved together with Rich in the Oika project, which he will explain in a minute. Rich is an environmental scientist, an expert in deep history, and I'll leave it now to him to go into the topic.
Okay, well thanks, Geert. Yeah, my name is Rich Blundell. Among other things, I've started an organization that seeks to communicate and cultivate ecological intelligence. And I'll get into that in a moment, but I wanted to just take a minute to assure you that the material that I'm going to present and the program is based in real research and real scientific knowledge. And, you know, to sort of prove that, well, actually, I guess I'll have to share my screen now. I've got this talk. Is that working? Because I can't see anything except my slides. No, is that working?
No slide has appeared as yet.
What's that?
No, we haven't had a slide from you yet.
Oh, sorry, hold on one sec. Let's see. Okay.
Okay, this is coming on. Yep, we now have you. That's great. Thanks, Rich.
Okay, good.
Yep.
So what I'd like to just sort of start here with is this an assurance to you that this work is based in real research, and to prove it, here's the cover page of my PhD dissertation, and I will just sort of show you all the references. So these are my references from my research. There are pages and pages of them to make sure that you feel comfortable that what I'm about to tell you is based in real research and scientific knowledge. So that took me about 5 years to compile all that information, and any young sort of, not that I'm young anymore, but any sort of early career academic will tell you that the most important thing they can do is to cite the sources of their knowledge. And so that's what that was. That's reference to all the scientific knowledge behind this work. But there's more to it than that. And so what I'd like to also do now is just take a moment to cite the other sources of knowledge that are in this work. And so the way this works was that as I was doing this research, it was kind of, what's the word, unconventional. So there was a lot of research design questions and methodological questions that I had to answer, and data analysis questions. And every day I would find myself just immersed in these problems, the problems of doing research. And so I would work myself into a kind of cognitive frenzy to figure this stuff out that I'm sure most of us are familiar with in one form or another, this idea that we live in our heads and we're constantly thinking and processing and doing all this stuff. But one that ended up happening over these 5 years was that I developed a walking practice, a practice where I would go into the woods and hike up a specific hill every day. And so see, these are some of my other references. These are the other references that they're not listed in my reference pages. And you can see that I referred to these sources throughout the seasons over 5 years. And sometimes some of these sources weren't even alive. There's a dead tree that I would walk by every day. And so what would happen is I would, at the bottom of the trail, I would start and head out full of intellectual ideas and sort of mental angst. And I would keep hiking and I would pass all of these trees on the way up. And eventually I would get to the summit and I would take a moment and I would just sit and sort of watch the clouds go by. You know, I'd catch my breath, you know, I'd just sort of wind down. And then I would start back down the hill. Okay, so this is after about an hour or so of pretty heavy hiking and thinking, asking questions. So then as I would head back down, my mind was basically cleared. And usually it was in this very specific spot. As I would pass, and this is the actual spot. As I would pass these trees, it almost felt like I was being tapped on the shoulder, like, hey. And suddenly I would get an answer. The answer to one of those questions that I was struggling with on the way up was suddenly be answered. And it literally felt like it was these trees that were tapping me on the shoulders and giving me these answers. And of course, you know, that's semi-metaphorical, but I just wanted to take a moment to also assure you that this research is based on that kind of knowledge, the kind of knowledge that's more distributed, less effable, an incarnate kind of intelligence that is also infused this. Now, in the dissertation, I wasn't allowed to cite this except for one place, the dedication page. So there it is, the one line that I got to give to those trees out of all those references to the bluefin tuna of Stellwagen Bank, that's another story, and to the oak trees of Red Hill. So there I was allowed, but that's not even included in the actual research. Like technically that had to stay outside of the scholarship, which I think is indicative of something important. The fact that it was, and I don't know if you remember all those pages of references, but they didn't feel like much. Whereas these sources, this is what it feels like. This is the kind of gratitude I feel for the trees, and it's missing from that other kind of knowledge. So I just wanted to sort of set the stage for what this thing is about, what this Oika idea is. And so, you know, but one of the core concepts of Oika is narrative or story. So I'm going to tell you another quick story before we get into what Oika really is. This photograph was taken in about 1910, somewhere in Arizona. This man was hired by the US Forest Service to head out into the Western United States and to prepare the land for ranchers that they were going to give the land to. And the thinking at the time was that, you know, if you're going to have land where you're going to put grazing animals, the best thing you can do to increase the productivity of that land is to remove the predators. So he was hired to go out there and do this. And we know this because he wrote down in his journal something that happened to him one day. He wrote, the problem is I can't see that. I'm going to have to move this. Hold on a sec. Is there any way I can move this so that I can actually see my own slide? I can't do it. Hold on one second. Well, you can read it. We were eating a high rim rock, at the foot of which a river elbowed its way. So he's looking down the valley and he sees a river and he's up there with his friend having lunch. And then what he saw, we thought was a doe forging the torrent of the whitewater. But when this animal, which they thought was a doe, climbed up the bank toward them and shook out her tail, they realized their error, that it was a wolf. And then a half a dozen pups sprung from the willows, and they all joined in a welcoming melee of wagging tails. It was literally a pile of playful wolves. But in those days, they had never heard of the possibility of the passing of an opportunity to kill a wolf. In a moment, they were pumping lead into the pack. So when our rifles were empty, the old wolf was down, a pup was dragging a leg into impassable slide rocks. So this is the mentality of the time, to go out there, to carry the kind of the culture from the East and bring it West into this ecosystem and clear it out. That was the paradigm of management, of resource management at the time. And this is what it led to. Essentially the extirpation of wolves and the near extinction of wolves in a lot of the states of the Western US. That is a story of separation. To import that culture into that ecosystem, that's what it's a story of. So I want to just kind of continue on that thread of the story of separation to today, which is a time that some geologists call the Anthropocene. And so this is a graphical depiction of the Anthropocene, and it's called the Planetary Boundaries Framework. And you can see that the Earth system is sort of divided up into these pie segments, and then what they do is they can measure different quantitative components of these ecosystems to put a sort of a measuring stick on how damaged or how we've reduced their resilience in all these different ecosystems. But I kind of have a problem with this that's still rooted in that same story of separation. Here's some more data for this Anthropocene story. You can see what's called the hockey stick profile of all these different graphs that show this exponential use of resources. And also the measurements of the actual Earth system's quantitative metrics that they can use to measure these things. And this previous graph, this one here, is a little more interesting because it's socioeconomic trends. So there's this suggestion that there's some linkage between these, the Earth system trends, and these, the socioeconomic trends. So they're acknowledging that, that all these things are somewhat connected. So that's a step in the right direction. But what these data sets fail to capture is the lived experience of the Anthropocene. And it's much more like this. This is a real, more experiential, but they don't measure the experience. They measure those other quantities, right? And the other thing that it fails to really capture is that what we think of as ecological issues extend into these other domains of social and economic and political domains. this diagram, which is the best diagram we have by the best scientists working on it, and good for them, but it doesn't capture any of those other realities. It doesn't capture the lived experience of the Anthropocene. It doesn't capture how these dissected elements are separated from political and economic and social issues. And so the story of separation is still there in a way. The other thing about this is that it fails to show how these systems are connected. It draws boundaries between them. In fact, it's called the planetary boundaries framework. I know the boundaries refers to the amount of impact that these things can sustain, but the fact that they're still using the boundary metaphor and that there's no interchange between these things. So the point here is that this idea of separation is still embedded and intrinsic to our best attempts to gain knowledge and to solve problems. And so that's where Oika steps in. Oika is, I'll tell you a little bit where the term comes from, but before I do that, I just wanted to say that this is an idea that's grounded in this, I don't know if this is a real thing or not, but it's a phrase that I've been using, ecological intelligence. And when I ask people what that means, I typically get one of two answers. The first answer is, the first sort of explanation of what ecological intelligence is, it's something out there. So I'm looking out a window right now, and I can see oak trees and birds and a squirrel. And if I think the squirrel, I see it has a kind of intelligence. It's collecting acorns from the oak trees. The oak tree provides the acorns, the squirrel uses them as food, it buries them. Some of those buried acorns become trees. And so there's this dynamic going on that has its own kind of intelligence. And the tree and the birds and the grass and the atmosphere and the squirrel, they're all participating in it in their own way. And just by being themselves, they're expressing that ecological intelligence. So then the other answer I typically get is that we hold an ecological, or we can hold an ecological intelligence within us. So when we recycle, or when we decide to drive less or buy a more fuel efficient car, we're somehow expressing ecological intelligence, and that's smart. And so there's this outer ecological intelligence, and then there's this inner ecological intelligence. And those two answers kind of reveal the fundamental insight here, and that is those two intelligences are the same thing. They're not out there or in here. That intelligence really is distributed. It's just that we tend to experience it as separate, inner and outer. And so that's what Oika is trying to explore, is that the dynamic between that unified intelligence that we can participate in. So just to give you a little bit of background about the word Oika, it comes from the ancient Greek word oiko, or oikos, which in the ancient Greek, or the very patriarchal society, referred to person, place, and property. And so that word oikos has become the root of the modern word eco, as in economy and in ecology. They share the same root. So what I've done with Oika is to sort of feminize it, to replace the O with an A, which makes it more inclusive and more expansive. How inclusive and how expansive? Well, it's cosmic. And in a moment, I'll try to tell you that story that makes it more inclusive and more expansive. But so the way instead of, once we do that, once we feminize it, instead of the person, in the ancient Greek conception, person meant the man. And the place in the ancient Greek meant the house. And the property meant everything in the house. That's what the Greeks meant by person, place, and property. The material in the house. But in the Oika conception, person refers to the being, the individual. And place, instead of being the house, is the habitat, the watershed, the valley, the mountain, the bay. So it's a more expansive place. And instead of property, it's practice. And practice refers to those things that we do that connect person and place. And when we do that, we find prosperity. So I've sort of manufactured these elements to fit, but that's what the word Oika is trying to refer to, that there is this coherent framework that goes from person to place to practice to prosperity. So I just wanted to make sure that we knew that. And currently I'm running courses in Oika, or Ecological Intelligence. And you can see a screenshot of one of our online courses here. And you can see that there's the 4 person, place, practice, prosper. And these are the modules that we work our way through in the course. Now, I can't see it because it's covered on my screen, but there's another, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th vertical column down there. You see the first selection of concepts that we use in the course. The top one is narrative or story. And then the one down from that should be emergence. And then the next one down from that should be fractals. Those are the 3 core concepts by which Oika instills ecological intelligence. There are more there, but those are, sort of later in the process. And so right now, originally 2020 was supposed to be devoted to me traveling around delivering lectures and things like presentations on Oika, but because of the pandemic, it's really, we've had to adapt it into this online course. And it's turned out to be a good thing. For one thing, it's forced me to, improve the content and get it all consolidated, but also it's people seem to really be interested in this course. So we've been running it as an online course that works essentially through this curriculum. The other element that has now expanded into is Oika Arts, which is, the idea here is that artists play a critical role in the creation of culture. And by designing and offering courses that are specifically geared to artists, we can get them to serve their more full role in society. So the idea here is that, and by the way, I'm trained in the sciences. And so throughout my entire academic career, I was never really asked to engage with the arts. I never took an art history course. I never took art philosophy, or I never understood the economics of art or anything like that. And I'm assuming that there might be something mirrored for artists, that you can go through your entire training period and never really engage with science. And so that's what Oika Arts, or Into the Artmosphere, is trying to address, is that separation between the arts and the sciences, and get them into a new, deeper dialogue through ecological intelligence. So, so that's kind of the background of Oika Arts and Into the Artmosphere. And Geert is curating at least one course right now, and we are planning on launching a couple of more in the UK in the coming months or weeks. So we just wanted to make sure we knew that. So another one of the core concepts within the Oika curriculum is this idea of ontological continuity, which is really just a big word to say that everything is connected. One of the primary sort of drivers of a field called Big History is Eric Chaisson, who's a astrophysicist at Harvard, and he wrote this. He says, if we are to articulate a unified worldview for all complex systems observed throughout nature, we must objectively and consistently model them identically. To restate once more, for clarifying emphasis, complex systems differ fundamentally, not in kind, but only in degree. That is the degree of complexity manifesting ontological continuity. So what does that actually mean? It takes a story to understand and to actually experience what that means. So what I'd like to do now is very briefly provide a natural history of art. And what my goal here is to do is to provide a narrative. This is a 13.8 billion year story, and I'm going to try and do it now in like 10 minutes. But the idea here is to show that there is continuity between the cosmos and art. Okay, so we all realize that the universe begins with a bang. This is the best interpretation that we have based on the evidence. Of course, we don't know what was there before the Big Bang. There's a big mystery there that I want to acknowledge, that this isn't a story that aims or claims to know everything. It's just what we know based on scientific pursuit, but it's not all inclusive. It's a provisional story, but it starts at the Big Bang. And in the background of the Big Bang, there are the fundamental forces, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces that are acting on that original plasma energy. And about 380,000 years, after about 380,000 years of cooling, we get to a period where the white hot plasma cools enough for photons to exist as discrete particles of light, at which point they immediately rush off into space or they tag along with space, and we get what's known as the cosmic background radiation. This is an image taken with a satellite, and this is just a graph, an image that can show you what this is a picture of. On the right there, you see the little satellite. It's looking out into the night sky, and it's spinning. It's taking a 360-degree picture in the microwave range of light. And if you look on this image, you see to the left there's a little blue disk. That blue disk it's called the surface of last scattering. It's that 380,000-year-old, that after the Big Bang, 380,000 years, cools enough, and then we get this surface that we can no longer see through in the microwave that obscures the Big Bang and everything that happened before it. But we can actually see it, and when we correct for it, we get this image. But what I want to point out is that this isn't a perfectly uniform image. You see splotches of orange and blue and yellow. What that's showing you is that the early universe was not perfectly uniform. In other words, there were areas that had more energy and more heat than other areas. If it had been perfectly uniform, nothing would have ever evolved, because there would have been no relationships. This point of space and this point of space would have no way of exchanging energy or information, and so nothing would have ever evolved. But luckily, there is imperfection built into the early universe, and this is an image of it. This is an ecology of light. There is no chemistry. There's no carbon. There's no phosphorus. There's no nitrogen in this image. This is just light. Those other things, more complex things, would come later out of the relationships of this primordial light. They won't quite tell you this in physics class, but this ecosystem has evolved into this ecosystem. So if you look around the room right now, where you are, everything that's there arose from these primordial relationships. It's an image that connects everything that we do and everything we are, everything we live among, to these creative process of the universe. And that's key, that the universe is this creative energy, and here we see it simplified so that we can actually see the whole thing in action. So behind the scenes of that image, gravity and the nuclear forces are sorting themselves out and finding new structures. So this is an image of the megascale structure. I'm sorry, that's not it. That's the wrong slide. That's the brain scan of a rat. Okay, there it is. So this is an artist's conception based on data of the real megascale structure of the universe. And you can see that it has that symmetry with the neurobiology of a mammal. That is a kind of fractal symmetry. And fractals is another one of those concepts that we explore in the Oika course. And I want to also just say right now, it's not just about the concept of fractals, it's about the experience of fractals. So the idea here is that when you encounter a fractal in your daily life, it becomes a reminder, a signpost that everything is connected, that ontological continuity is real, and you're participating in it. These are the kinds of things that we talk about in the course. So given enough time, hydrogen emerges through those same fundamental forces. Those hydrogen atoms will converge under gravity to form the first stars. So we get the first generation of stars. Some of those stars evolve into these beautiful patterns we call galaxies through natural processes. Some of those stars that are big enough will go supernova. And in the process, they reconfigure hydrogen into all of the other elements up to, well, stars do it up to iron, but supernovae are so powerful and there's such a combinatorial force there that it creates all of the raw materials that are in our phones, that are in our blood. You know, the iron in our blood was produced this way. And so, again, the story of the universe is telling us that, you know, we are made of this stuff. And of course, everybody knows the phrase, we are star stuff, but that's not just a metaphor, you know, that's actually scientific reality. And so I'm just extending that forward now. And from the rubble of a supernova, in fact, we think there was one in our stellar neighborhood about 5 billion years ago, from which the debris congregates rocky materials to form the first planets. And so here you have an artist's conception of a accretionary disk around a central star, the sun. And you can see that it's a new ecosystem. This is like before we had an ecology of light, now we have an ecology of rock. And you can see how complexity's happening here. We've got planetary systems forming. And on one particular planet, we have this is an early rendition of the Earth. And if you look at it, there's no life down there. You know, that's completely inhospitable for life, but it's still a planetary ecosystem. And so there are theories about how life began, and we go into great depth on this. This is panspermia. This is the warm, shallow pool, the hydrothermal vents theory. We have all these theories about how life started, but what's really important to know is, like, we may not know exactly because the evidence for how it happened has been consumed by it. And so we've lost that. But the fact that there are plausible explanations, again, shows that it makes sense that, you know, that life is on a continuum with all these cosmic scale processes. And so this is an image, you know, again, artist's rendition of, you know, a Cambrian seafloor where you see trilobites moving around on this little ooid calcium carbonate precipitate substrate, and you've got your crinoids there. And what we see happening here is biology has now happened, right? So biology has emerged in the universe, and it immediately gets to work creating more complexity. And so these trilobites, given time, given new relationships, just like photons in relationship, trilobites in relationships will diversify. And you can see fractal patterns here. You can see how life has a kind of efficiency to it to build on previous patterns. We see new complexity, like in this one, I'm not sure if you can tell, but there are little calcite lensed eyes there in this thing. And they're getting more and more beautiful. Now, we'll just jump ahead here and say that over on the other side of the Earth, there are these volcanic eruptions that are happening. And for whatever reasons, the trilobites go extinct. So they're gone. So whatever they were doing, you know, wasn't what they needed to be doing to be here with us today. But that their extinction opens up a new opportunity for other creatures. And this is another lineage that happened about then, where these large reptilian creatures with more complex brains than a trilobite start to experiment with different body styles, different life ways, and we see this amazing bloom of different kinds of dinosaurs. We see new predator-prey relationships. Again, it's a predator-prey relationship is really on a continuity with the relationship between electromagnetism and the weak nuclear force. So we see this continuity even in these dinosaurs. But remember that early Earth, when there was all those asteroids and planetesimals floating around. Well, it turns out one of those asteroids had gone out on a long orbit and now was returning. And 65 million years ago, it re-enters the Earth's orbit, impacts the planet, the dinosaurs go extinct. So whatever they were doing with those little reptilian brains may have been cool, but it wasn't what they needed to be doing to be here. The point there is that if you had dropped yourself down on the Earth back there in the Cretaceous and looked around, you would have thought this was a planet of reptiles. And that was the way to be, because that was the success. Well, being big and ferocious and clever is no guarantee, that you're going to survive long term. So the dinosaurs have gone extinct, but again, this opens up a new opportunity. Here we see some primates walking across the plains of Africa with a volcano in the background there. And I like to imagine how this volcano is spewing out these rocks, and maybe some of these rocks land out on the savanna, and this primate, maybe that's Lucy there, Australopithecine afarensis, she picks up one of these rocks, and she sees that she can use it for, if she modifies it just a little bit, she could use it to crush a nut or something like that. But what she's really doing there, what this primate is doing, because she now has the kind of cognitive complexity, is to think about a story, that if she does this, this will happen. That there's a logic there that is new in the universe. Planets don't do that, but primates do. And so what we're really seeing here is the emergence of story kind of embedded in the rocks. And I know this is a stretch, but it's an interpretation that's not outside the realm of possibility. That what we're seeing here is the emergence of story in the universe, in this little primate. So this is 2.5 million years ago, Homo habilis. Now check this out. Did you feel the difference between that and that? Make a note of that feeling of this little sort of momentary delight that this thing is beautiful, right? It's symmetrical. In fact, it's more symmetrical than it needs to be. If you look closely, that cutting edge of this stone tool extends all the way around it. It would actually be a more effective tool if it wasn't, because you have to hold this thing and it's sharp. So whoever made this prioritized aesthetic over functionality. So I think what we can say we're seeing here is the emergence of art, really, the emergence of aesthetic appreciation in this stone tool. And it came with a feeling. Remember when we saw that? We saw the beauty and we could feel it. So this took about 1 million years to get there. This is Homo erectus. Here's another stone tool, which it doesn't look all that impressive, but when you think about it, I was cutting a potato the other day and this came to my mind. I was like cutting it and all these things. What's cool about this is that in order to create the stone tool that the Neanderthal wanted, it had to create the surface in the base rock first. So it took a rock and it chipped away and it chipped away, and it could see the piece that it wanted in the chips, not in the chips that were falling away, but in the piece that was left. And archaeologists can actually sequence these blows. And so what it shows is that this Neanderthal was seeing one thing in terms of another. It was seeing the tool in the terms of the base rock. That is the definition today of metaphor. So what we're actually seeing here is, and I've tried this, if you you have to be able to see one thing in terms of another. That's metaphor. So we can see that primates are on this kind of cognitive, creative adventure that, you know, other creatures hadn't done. And so this is the emergence of metaphor. So we know through, you know, archaeology, paleontology, about the diaspora out of Africa. So our ancestors left the plains of East. This is the generally accepted chronology, that we left the plains of Africa. We came down from the trees and we set out now with these other capacities. Now remember these higher cognitive capacities. We set out across every habitat that the planet has to offer. So these early hominids had to cross savannas, forests, deserts. They skirted glaciers. They crossed estuaries, and that took generation upon generation upon generation. And in each one of those encounters, each one of those long periods of relationship, these primate bands acquired something from the environment. They acquired ecological intelligence from every habitat that the planet has to offer. And if you think about the chimps who we share an ancestor with back there in Africa, then the chimps never left. And they're still essentially chimps, but we left. We exposed ourselves to all this ecological diversity. And we did this, remember, with these capacities. So when story, the capacity for story, the capacity for aesthetic appreciation, and the capacity for metaphor set out across all of the ecosystems of the planet, and they encounter this in the environment, they create this, okay? So the idea here is that our earliest expressions of real art tended to express our intimate connection with the world that we were in, the natural world that we were encountering on our adventure. And so when our ancestors, sapiens, encountered a scene like this, it would result in something like this. All I'm saying here is that hominids, you know, the first impulse of art was to express our deep connection and intimacy with these things. And we know it's intimate because whoever carved this knew about the internal anatomy, and so was probably butchering and eating this. And so there was a deep reciprocal relationship being expressed here. And this is why, you know, this is how artists have really sort of entered the story in a way. And this is why me as a scientist is reaching out to the artists. And so eventually, just to cut to the chase, we end up with metaphor evolving through human history, and we get Shakespeare, and this is essentially Shakespeare in the cave. But so I wanted to, that's the story of the universe. And it's told in a way where there's continuity between the physics of the Big Bang and artists. The creative inspiration of artists is continuous with the science, is what I'm trying to emphasize there. So, but before I go on, I kind of wanted to tell another story. This man, this is Aldo Leopold. He is one of the highly respected. He's died a while back, but he was active, you know, from the 20s, 30s, and 40s as a conservationist, and he's responsible for establishing some of the biggest national parks in America. So he's a great conservationist. I have a feeling I know where this picture was taken. It looks like Ambaselli, but I'm not sure. But so Leopold is a guy who spent a lot of time in the Gila wilderness of Arizona and New Mexico. And so he writes about it. He writes at length about his relationship to this land. But so that's Aldo Leopold. That's this guy. But do you remember this guy? Well, this guy is this guy. They're the same guy. My point here is that there's some kind of transformation that goes on. And we know it's the same guy because we'll pick up the story when this was all written by Leopold, when our rifles were emptied, the old wolf was down, the pup was dragging such. And then he goes on to say, I'm not gonna be able to read this. We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then and have known ever since that there was something new to, I can't read it, in me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. I was young then, I had a full of trigger itch, but after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountains agreed with such a view. And so you can see that he went through some kind of deep transformation that from his time spent in that habitat. I'm trying to suggest here that just like the primates who spent generation after generation in the habitats of Earth, a single generation spent in a habitat can have a deeply transformative effect on people through this mechanism of ecological intelligence. It's like the way the trees were speaking to me. You know, the landscape can speak to Leopold or anybody who just listens. And it's an intelligence, what's communicated is an intelligence that is aligned with nature as opposed to separated from it. So, so what we see here is that as Leopold spent time here, eventually, over time, his work resulted in the establishment of these vast areas of, are now wolf rehabilitation areas. And so we see these wolf introduction programs, much of this based on that guy who back in 1909 was the guy who was there to exterminate them. And now we see that there is this paradigm shift that can happen. So it's possible, given the opportunity for the world to speak to us, if we set up the conditions for listening to this intelligence. And that's what Oika is really about. So that's what I think happened to Leopold in between those two times, is that he went through this process of learning through ecological intelligence, which is what the Oika course seeks to instill in artists. So that is my presentation. Hopefully it wasn't too incoherent, but here's my information if anybody wants to check out oika.com or follow me on Twitter, where I announce the work that we're doing. So with that, I'll bring it back to Geert and the group if there are any questions or any things that people want to talk about. Did I leave? No.
Okay. Andrew, I think you have your mute on.
Thank you. What I was going to say, I'm going to trust you all. I've unmuted all of you, including myself now. So there were no questions in the chat. So if anyone has any questions, there's a reactions button on your window at the bottom of your window. You can click on that and leave a reaction in your video box, or else you can say something or wave something. But the best thing is that when you do, is just to say your name, because a lot of people just speak and we don't know who you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Fiona.
Yeah, my name is Fiona. I'm just interested to know what Leopold's full name is, so I can look him up.
I put his I put the Leopold legacy in the chat. It's Aldo Leopold.
Aldo Leopold.
Aldo, A-L-D-O. Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating.
The story, by the way, is told that you can read that essay that he wrote. It's called Thinking Like a Mountain.
Thinking Like a Mountain.
Yep.
So is that published as a book?
It's an essay. I think it's in the San County Almanac. I think that's where it first came out. But you know, if you search for that, you'll be able to find that essay online somewhere.
Yeah, I will. I'll definitely do that. I'm working on a project about actually covering some of these sentiments of yours. So I'm particularly interested. I'm sorry I came online a bit late because I was struggling to get on. But I'm glad I'm here.
We are too.
Are there anyone who wants to ask a question? I mean, Geert, would you like to explain what's happening next at the end of the week?
Yes, if there are no comments or questions anymore about the introduction that Rich gave, we invite you all for a longer trajectory that commences with a first session of a course of 4 weeks that will start next Saturday. But maybe I'll let Rich explain a bit more about that for the ones that are interested to get into this process. After this course, there is a creative part in which I will accompany you in a preparation of an exhibition, and Rich and I will be interact with you in the creation of works of art during a period for several months, based on the concepts and visions that we will share and explore during the course. But I'll not jump in front of Rich. I just let him talk about the course first.
Sure, I'll talk about the course, but I also don't want to forget Sally's question here about shamanism. So if we forget, remind us. So the course, the way it's sort of panning out is running. We do these informational calls, which is what this is. This call right now is sort of an informational call to put feelers out to see if there are people who are interested in diving into this stuff. In particular, we're looking for artists. The idea there is that I believe that artists have a highly developed sensitivity to the world, and also, you know, a keen sort of awareness for beauty and you know, an intimacy with subject. And so by reaching out to artists, we're setting up the conditions that wherein artists can realign culture and nature. And I know many artists feel this impulse and this calling, but somehow we've gotten off track, and art is creating crap culture. And so the idea is to create a new force in art that's scientifically derived. In other words, not woo-woo. And so we can still have all of these profound spiritual responses without abandoning science. And so I'm really keen to have new language and new conversations. And so the Oika course is designed really to provide that kind of language, that kind of vocabulary that artists can use to talk about their work in a way that validates it for the future. The idea is to shift culture. Yeah. I'm not sure how much that was lost, but so, and then just to address the shamanism question, for me, shamanism is fundamentally about healing. And in that respect, Oika is very much about that. Not though necessarily with all of the aesthetic trappings of what we think of as shamanism. So I don't think that calling up, you know, the conventional sort of aesthetic of shamanism is necessarily the way to go. I think we need a new aesthetic, one that's contemporary, one that's new, but with the same fundamental intention as shamanism, which is to help us heal and reconnect with the big mystery.
Okay, so can I just come in there, just in case people didn't realize we just got hacked there. So I'm sorry you saw an image come on your screen. and we were visited by someone who wasn't invited, and they came through the security system. So this is what's so extraordinary about video conferencing. You'd never know what happens. So I hope no one was caught out by that and felt embarrassed. We've literally coming up to the time when this event should run to, but we actually don't have an event after it. So if there's any other questions that people would like to put to Rich or Geert, maybe you'd like to do that now.
Hi, I have a question actually for Richard, if anyone can hear me.
Sure,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Hey, happy days. So at the moment I'm working on a piece of writing. It's interviewing tree surgeons, and what I'm very struck with is by tree surgeons. Obviously, there's a wide spectrum of people who get involved with tree surgery, from like people with very sort of at times high aesthetic sense. Where do you consider the sort of limits of art to be? Some of the tree surgeons that I'm speaking to almost a certain level of sort of how they carry on in the trees are almost conceiving what they're doing as a sort of like a movement art. I don't sound too sort of woo and out there sort of thing, but this comes out in some people who are working at a very high level, is that the work they're doing, the movement they're performing in their trees for a monetary function, it hits the definitions of art. So where do you consider the limits of art?
I don't consider there to be a limit, but I do think that one of the things I run into is that artists have their established routines and rituals and their own preconceptions about what art is and what isn't. And what I'd like to hear from your tree surgeon friends, that if I understand it correctly, you're saying that they consider themselves doing art, that it's some kind of inspired art. I want to hear them talk about it. I want to hear them using language that breaks the category of what a tree surgeon is, and breaks the category of what an artist is. And I think that can, that will advance our ecological intelligence. So yeah, I think everyone could talk that way. I think why we have forfeited that creativity in any field is because that creativity comes from a source that we can be close to, that we can be part of, that we can be intimate with. So why would we give that away? And why would we write that out of the standard narrative of what a tree surgeon is? So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but those are the kinds of, that's just one little example of how we can start breaking categories and reinventing prosperity through that.
Rich, there have been a couple of questions put into the chat. I don't know whether you can read them. Annie Lord, is Annie Lord there on the call? Would Annie like to say her question again?
Well, I see her question. It's, would you be able to give an example of artists or artworks which you believe align with Oika principles? This is the work that I do now, and it's interesting because it's not necessarily reflected in the art itself. So in other words, Oika art, or what I've been calling Oikadelic art, isn't about trees and brooks and things like necessarily. It could, I can't see how, but it could be, stainless steel industrial sculpture. It could be that. What's more important is that it's the process. It's how that artist managed to abandon ego long enough to create a piece in alliance with nature, as opposed to thinking it came from this singular genius source within them. It actually comes from the ecology that they're embedded in. So when I'm talking about what Oika art is, I'm looking and wanting to hear about that. How it expresses itself is for artists. That's for the audience to decide. I have no authority to tell an artist what's good art. All I can do is listen, is hear them out, and listen to what they say about where that creativity comes from. Because if it's tapping in in a way that they can articulate that it comes from that it's part of the whole creative engine of nature, then it's Oika art. And that's just what I bring to that conversation. So, and to answer your question, yes, there are artists that I work with, you know, Fred, Dina, you know, and you'd meet these people, Rita, Terrence, you know, of course, when I listen to them talk about the inspiration of their work and how nature speaks to them, then it's definitely, but you'd have to join the conversation to see that. Yeah.
And Rich, what about Bridget McKenzie? Bridget McKenzie, would you like to ask your question, Bridget?
Hello. Yes, I wonder about the engagement with the long history of ecological arts, which a lot of which is already based on science. And I don't know whether the intention is to work with artists who aren't already steeped in that, or to collaborate on a more sort of mutual basis with eco art experts.
Of course, I mean, it's open to anybody who is, you know, who's committed to this kind of thing. I do occasionally encounter people who, you know, kind of claim to be eco art, but the thing the thing that I'm trying to develop here is missing somehow from what they do. And it's tricky because, you know, artists, as you may know, are complex people. And so, and a lot of them are trained in, you know, there's a legacy of training artists that I'm now learning about, where, you know, it's all about the artist and their creative genius, you know, their sort of idiosyncratic genius. And so there's a lot to untangle there. But if the question is Oika open to that? It is, but not, let me say one thing, and I'll see if I can just say this very clearly. This is not about science enlisting artists to present their work. No, that's just the, you know, that's the art market working. I'm talking about artists who can get us to feel these concepts of emergence and fractals and cybernetics and radical affection. And I want.
Well, have we lost Rich? I think we have, just briefly.
It seems that the image is frozen.
Yeah, his image is frozen. So, well,
So,
I'm sorry about that, but he might come back. Let's hope he does.
Yes, he will come back. I'll continue a bit.
Well, can you answer Ruth Broadbent's question?
Sure. But just to compliment on what Bridget was asking, Rich is back. So what is the course is about? It's actually opening a channel for communication as well, facilitating to communicate about your own practice and own work, but by adding principles, ideas, and visions that will grow along this trajectory with Rich. It is not built on something. It is not based on prerequisite knowledge or practice that is already happening, but is more about communication. And this communication will be facilitated in a 4-week course, which is more about the conceptual, about diving into new ideas and scientific knowledge, and afterwards followed by a period of action, of creating, which will be as well a collective process. And not putting into not directing you somewhere as an artist. You as an artist, you know your practice. We just stay in the sidelines and hoping to provoke, stimulate new ways of working. So we are actually more directed to people that don't have any background in the so-called eco-arts than the people that have. Although we stimulated the dialogue between both approaches, people that have already experience and others that are really interested in moving their practice towards a more ecological, intelligent way of thinking and working. So the course is the first step, and the second step will be the creation. The course will indeed start next Saturday. If you want to take part of it, you can just register for that. We will have to see how many people will be part of it. Maybe we will have to make 2 groups, but we can discuss that in a stage where we have more information about how many people are actually wanting to take part of this trajectory with us. Richard, do you want to add something to that?
No, that's pretty good. I mean, if people want to learn more about the actual architecture of it, they can ask now or later, and I'd be happy to answer that.
Okay, so I'm going to close this meeting. Literally, well, I'll offer you one last question. If there is anyone who wants to ask about this course structure, if not, I think we'll close the meeting. Anyone shouting out? No. Okay, so a big thank you to Geert and Rich for coming and presenting into the atmosphere. Peter, are you asking a question? Peter would like to, I'm not sure. I think he's just waving goodbye. Okay, so we'll bring this meeting to a close. Once again, there are lots and lots of events taking place in the next 8 or 9 days for the Urban Tree Festival. They're all free. Do please sign up to them. And we are going to try and improve the information and instructions on how to join an event, because we picked up that that's been a bit of a problem. But everyone keep safe and well. And please remember to donate to the festival, because that would make it really helpful, and we would be able to give each of the contributors a little gift to say thank you for their work. Anyway, keep safe and well, and see you tomorrow at the festival.
Thank you all. Thank you, Andrew.